Widespread criticism of Donald Trump after he announced the US would halt funding to the World Health Organization, the US president accusing it of mismanaging the coronavirus crisis. G7 finance ministers agreed to relieve the world's poorest countries of debt payments this year. G20 leaders are expected to finalise the deal later on. Amongst the countries eligible are 40 in sub-Saharan Africa. And Nigeria records 30 new cases of COVID-19, its biggest one-day rise. 2 weeks after parts of the country went into lockdown, we have a report on how locals are coping there. Hello and thanks for joining us here on France 24. I'm Claire Pride. China has urged the US to fulfill its obligations to the World Health Organization. This after Donald Trump said he was going to halt funding to the UN agency, accusing it of mismanaging and covering up the spread of COVID-19 after it emerged in China. The editor-in-chief of the Lancet Medical Journal has called Trump's decision a crime against humanity. It's dangerous, said Bill Gates, whose foundation is the WHO's #2 contributor. Critics say Trump is trying to deflect blame for his own failings. US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying on Tuesday that Trump had caused unnecessary death and economic disaster. Here's what Trump said about the WHO.
American taxpayers provide between $400 million and $500 million per year to the WHO. In contrast, China contributes roughly $40 million a year and even less. As the organization's leading sponsor, the United States has a duty to insist on full accountability. One of the most dangerous and costly decisions from the WHO was its disastrous decision to oppose travel restrictions from China and other nations.
That move by Trump to suspend funding to the WHO is a major financial blow. The US is the biggest single contributor to its budget. I asked our business editor, Stephen Carroll, how the UN agency is funded.
There are two main sources of revenue for the WHO. One are what's called assessed contributions, which are essentially membership fees paid by the 194 countries that are members of the WHO. And that amount is decided based on the population and wealth of the country involved. But assessed contributions only account for less than a fifth of the WHO's funding. More than 3/4 of its funding comes from voluntary contributions. That's from governments, from charitable foundations, from companies in some cases that are directed towards global healthcare efforts and public health efforts that are run by the organization. The US is the biggest contributor in the last 2-year budget cycle for the WHO. It accounted for around 15% of its funding, $893 million it contributed over those 2 years. Again, the majority of that money being a voluntary contribution, its assessed contribution, its membership fee is only around $240 million. The #2 contributor to the WHO was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which funded around 9% of its operations over those 2 years, around $530 million. And following that, you have the UK at around 8%, the Gavi Vaccines Alliance at just under 7%, and Germany at just over 5%. China, by contrast, only contributed around 1.5% of the WHO's funding over the last 2 years, a sum of $86 million. Now, the US had already planned to reduce its assessed contribution in the current year. It was going to cut that in half to about $58 million. But what President Trump is announcing now is a much larger cut to voluntary contributions, which is a much bigger revenue hit to the WHO.
So, as you said there, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a big contributor, and Bill Gates has called Trump's decision or described his move as dangerous. What sort of damage will this move do to the organization?
15% blows a massive hole in the WHO's budget at a time that it's already struggling to fund itself. Now, the US money over the past 2 years has gone into programs like polio eradication, access to health and nutrition, and also vaccines for preventative diseases. So those programs will be running short of money if the US continue or suspends its funding as it's announced it will do. The WHO did secure a small increase in its membership fees for the current budget cycle. That's for this year and next year. But as you've been saying, Bill Gates, the second biggest contributor through his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, saying that this is as dangerous as it sounds to cut funding by this amount. The WHO has already been appealing for extra money to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's looking to raise $685 million. It's actually already secured a donation from the United States of almost $15 million towards that effort. That money's already been paid in. But of course, if they don't get the voluntary contributions to the order of around $400 million it was expecting this year, that will make things very difficult for the organisation over the course of the next 2 years.
France's finance minister has announced that dozens of countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, can expect a debt moratorium this year. Bruno Le Maire was speaking before a meeting of G7 finance ministers and central bank governors. Later, the G20 is expected to finalise the deal. Emerald Maxwell reports.
Calls for debt cancellation for the world's poorest nations have been growing amid coronavirus. Pope Francis made an appeal over Easter, as did French President Emmanuel Macron in a televised address on Monday. The predicted collapse in global commodities trade following COVID-19 threatens to hit African countries particularly hard. Now, finance ministers from G7 countries have agreed to throw them a lifeline with a moratorium on payments if G20 governments also agree. In an interview with France 24's sister radio station RFI, Macron said it was a good start.
Mais le moratoire, ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire on ne rembourse plus les intérêts. Vous nous laissez de l'oxygène. C'est une première mondiale. C'est une étape indispensable et je pense que c'est une formidable avancée. Maintenant, elle doit précéder d'autres étapes qui sont des étapes de restructuration de la dette africaine.
Critics say a temporary delay doesn't go far enough. Sub-Saharan Africa is on the brink of its first recession in 25 years, and its economies are unlikely to be in a position to restart payments anytime soon. But any debt write-off would require Beijing to take a leading role. That's because China is now top of Africa's creditor list, having lent it 40% of its $365 billion debt. The rest is owed to the Paris Club, the IMF, the World Bank and private creditors. China's foreign ministry said in a statement to Reuters that it was willing to study the possibility of debt relief programs jointly with the international community. With its own economy expected to contract for the first time in 3 decades, China has so far signalled little real appetite to do so.
Nigeria has recorded its biggest one-day rise in COVID-19 cases. On Tuesday, it confirmed 30 new infections. That's almost 400 in all. The government extending a lockdown on 3 major states by an extra 2 weeks. Lagos is amongst the places under lockdown, and many people there say they feel increasingly unsafe.
Vendors at this Lagos street market have been struggling to make ends meet since Nigeria's lockdown began 2 weeks ago. With few clients, little income and no savings to rely on, many are finding it difficult to feed themselves.
Most times you see your neighbors coming out to ask you for food, if there's anything for them to eat. They are traders, so they sell every day to be able to survive. They don't have money saved one place or locked down somewhere.
Despite these economic hardships, Muhammadu Buhari announced Monday that the lockdown would be extended for at least 2 more weeks. Nigerian police also said it dispatched reinforcements to Lagos and Ogun State to deal with troublemakers after it arrested around 200 suspected criminals on Sunday. Lagos residents say they've witnessed a surge in crime and insecurity since the start of the lockdown and are beginning to fear for their lives.
I was robbed while I was going home, so I was outside my house. But now the robbers break into people's home and rob because of coronavirus. I've been going to market since I was born. My mom is over 60. She's been selling these markets. She has never been robbed.
Muhammadu Buhari also pledged a series of measures to help the most vulnerable, including distributing thousands of tons of food to the country's poorest households. Yet several NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, have called on Nigeria to do more to prevent the COVID-19 epidemic from bringing about widespread famine.
Some schools have reopened in Denmark, nurseries, kindergartens and primary schools, but not everywhere. They were shut for a month over the coronavirus. Schools have been asked to make sure there's 2 meters between desks and that children only play together in small groups. Secondary schools aren't expected to reopen before May 10th. Now, in his national address on Monday, France's president acknowledged that the lockdown here is particularly hard for the country's poorest people. And he said disadvantaged families and students would get help. What kind of help was discussed at today's cabinet meeting? Ellen Gainsford reports.
It's a security net to help the most vulnerable. The coronavirus outbreak has put many of France's poorest households in a precarious position. Responding to this crisis, the French government says around 4 million families with children under 18 will receive a one-off payment from the state, while individuals on state benefits will also be given a payment of around €150. Students who are struggling financially will be helped, particularly those whose families are overseas. And there are more plans to help small and medium businesses. 900,000 have already applied for state funding. The pot of money available to help them has been increased from 1 billion to 6 billion euros. Each small business could receive up to €1,500, while the criteria for loans guaranteed by the state has been loosened, and some businesses in receivership could now also be eligible.
It's been a year since Paris's iconic Notre Dame Cathedral went up in flames, the French president thanking those working on its reconstruction in a video released by the presidential palace. He also said everything was being done, despite the circumstances, to reach the deadline he fixed of 5 years. Catherine Norris-Trent is following this story for us. She joins me now. Catherine, the restoration works have been frozen because of the coronavirus. When are they likely to get going again?
Well, that is the question on everybody's lips. We spoke to the French general, the French former chief of military staff, who's been put in charge of the restoration of Notre Dame just ahead of this 1-year anniversary. And he told France 24 that he wanted to get work restarted as soon as possible to try and meet this ambitious 5-year deadline set by President Macron. The problem, he said, is that they've got these specialist builders and restorers who've been helping from all over France. So there's a problem bringing them all to Paris, lodging them safely in the conditions that respect the security measures to do with coronavirus, and then also ensuring that they're safe from the virus on the building site, because this is a building site which has seen a lot of difficulties in the year since the fire. There were problems, fears about lead contamination, so already there are very strict measures in place when you get onto the building site. People have to have a shower, put on specialist equipment, go through various checks. Then the building site has also been delayed by high winds as well. So it's a very sensitive building, an 850-year-old building, and there are problems just making sure everyone can be safe. The general in charge of the reconstruction, they did tell us he hoped that some of the people involved in getting down the pieces of scaffolding which are still on the roof, they have been on the roof since the fire, bringing them down is a priority because they could make the cathedral unstable, and that because the workers taking down the scaffolding will be suspended by ropes and clearly more than 1.5 meters apart, that they could be starting work on the site again as soon as possible. He said he hoped in the coming weeks.
Catherine, you reported from Notre Dame on the night of the fire. How far has the work come since then, and can it really be reopened in 2024?
Well, it is an extremely tight timescale, and even President Macron acknowledged that in his video address that was put out by the Élysée Palace this Wednesday, saying that it was a tight deadline, but in such troubled times you had to set yourself challenges and that they would try and meet them. And there have been several delays already. So a 2-month shutdown on the building site would, of course, pose difficulties. But when you look back to the night of the fire itself, I remember very clearly standing outside the cathedral on the night of the 15th of April 2019 as those huge flames burned away at large parts of the roof. And of course, the spire, the once iconic spire of Notre Dame, fell to the gasps of the crowds of public who were watching on the riverbanks on the nearby River Seine. Well, they have come a long way. The teams have managed to completely clear the rubble that was going down the nave of their cathedral. They've been doing a lot of testing of the stones to see how badly fire damaged and water damaged those stones were, because the firemen of Paris pumped an awful lot of water onto the flames to try and put it out. But there is still a gaping hole in the roof of Notre Dame. So rebuilding it, clearly still a huge challenge, and another setback here with this delay from coronavirus.
Indeed, thank you, Catherine. Catherine at Norris Trent reporting there. And that's it for this edition. Thanks for watching. Take care.